We are about to start the 2025 World Series, and in this video I wanted to go back through the World Series history to see what the most common World Series matchups of all time are. What is going on, everybody? Thanks for joining me back on my channel, Brutus on Baseball. The World Series is about to start. The Toronto Blue Jays, Canada's team representing the American League, against the juggernaut that is the Dodgers of Los Angeles, representing the National League, in a matchup we have never seen in World Series history. And that got me thinking, right? I wanted to have a little bit of fun and look back through the history of the World Series to see what are the most common matchups between two teams all time. When I started digging a little bit more into it, I started to see some consistencies, which made me think a little bit more. So I'm actually going to put this into two parts. The first part is the most common team matchups we've seen, but also what are the most common matchups between cities going head-to-head in the World Series. And so I'm going to look at those two a little bit differently in two sets of top fives coming up. And stay tuned to the very end because I am going to share with you a couple very historic team matchups that we have never seen in Major League Baseball World Series history. So let's jump right into it. To start off, there is a four-way tie for what is essentially fourth place. So I'm not going to go to a number 5 here, but it features 4 different head-to-head matchups of pretty historic teams. Listed in no particular order, they include the Detroit Tigers against the Chicago Cubs. This matchup goes way back in time to the first decade of the World Series, in which the Cubs took home the title in 1907 and 1908. But as many baseball fans know, especially Cubs fans, the team had an incredibly long title drought between 1908 and 2016. So when the Tigers and Cubs met up again in 1935 and 1945, both of those series were won by the Tigers this time, evening up the all-time record at 2 World Series apiece for both teams. The next tied for 4 is the Athletics versus the Giants. Most commonly thought of as a battle of the Bay Area, this sentiment will actually no longer hold true as the Athletics have moved temporarily to Sacramento on their way to Las Vegas. But in reality, these two teams, the A's and the Giants, only met once in the World Series in 1989 while they were neighbors in the Bay Area, a World Series that was swept by the Athletics and known more for the Loma Prieta earthquake rather than any actual baseball action on the field because it was a sweep by the A's. Other than that meeting though, the teams actually met up the other 3 times when both teams called the East Coast home. The Athletics in Philadelphia and the Giants in New York, with the Giants winning the first matchup in 1905 and the Athletics winning in 1911 and 1913 behind their $1 million infield. The all-time record is Athletics with 3 wins and the Giants with 1. The next tied for 4 is the Boston Red Sox versus the St. Louis Cardinals. The Red Sox were another team that endured a very long title drought between 1918 and 2004. So knowing that the Cardinals and Red Sox first 2 World Series meetings were in 1946 and 1967, make it pretty clear that the Cardinals took both of those series. Although both of them were very close series, with the Cardinals having to wait and take each one of them home in Game 7. But the Red Sox would get even with the Cardinals by beating them to break their historic curse during that 2004 World Series, and they would follow that up with another win against the Cardinals in 2013, evening up the all-time record at 2 World Series apiece. The fourth set of teams that have met up head-to-head in the World Series 4 times is the Yankees versus the Braves. The first meeting between these two teams actually featured New York against the Milwaukee Braves in 1957, with that version of the Braves winning a tight series by taking a Game 7. The teams would meet again the next season in 1958, and the Yankees would get even by taking that series in 7 games again. The Braves and Yankees would meet up twice more in 1996 and 1999, this time featuring a New York versus Atlanta matchup that would see the Yankees take both series fairly handily. The all-time record between these two teams is Yankees with 3 wins, the Braves with only 1. Now, sliding into third place, 2 teams that have met up 5 times, the Cardinals and the New York Yankees. The Cardinals would reach the World Series for the first time and beat the Yankees in 1926, during the time that the Yankees had Murder's Row. But the Yankees would get even with a win of their own in 1928, only 2 years later. The Cardinals would take the third matchup in 1942 between the two teams, and the Yankees would even it up the very next year in 1943. But the Cardinals would win the rubber match between these two with a win in 1964, an instant classic of a World Series that would go 7 games and feature a complete game win by Bob Gibson to bring home the championship for the Cardinals. The all-time record for this one is Cardinals with 3 wins and the Yankees with 2. The second highest amount of matchups is the Giants versus the Yankees. They met up 7 times. This is a matchup that goes back a very long time and saw the Yankees match up against their crosstown rival New York Giants 6 times before the Giants would move to San Francisco for the 1958 season. The Giants took the first 2 series from the Yankees and Babe Ruth in 1921 and 1922 for back-to-back wins, but the Yankees would become the monster of a team we know them as, starting with their win over the Giants in 1923. They would follow that up with more wins in 1936, 1937, and 1951. And the Yankees would win the last matchup between the two teams in 1962 after the Giants had moved out west. The all-time record is the Yankees with 5 wins and the Giants with only 2. Now the number 1 matchup of all time we should all know is the Dodgers versus the Yankees. They have met up 12 times in the World Series. I imagine you're sensing a theme here, right? With the Yankees having made the World Series a total of 41 times in their history, winning 27 of those, by the way. The most common matchups in history will more often than not involve the Yankees in some way. That's why we've seen them in 3, 2, and 1, and even 4. But the Dodgers and Yankees have met up a total of 12 times in the World Series, including the first 7 times while both teams were still located in New York and Brooklyn, and the last 5 times with the teams on opposite coasts. The Yankees took the first 5 matchups in 1941, 47, 49, 1952, and 1953, before the Dodgers could finally bring down the juggernaut in 1955. The Yankees would win once more, though, in 1956, before the Dodgers moved out west, where they would meet up again in 1963, 1977, 1978, 1981, and finally 2024, with the Dodgers taking 3 of those series from the Yankees. The current record between the two teams is the Yankees with 8 wins and the Dodgers with only 4. So, after looking at the top 5 all-time World Series matchups between teams, I thought it would be interesting to look at the same question in a different way to see if there would be different answers. Major League Baseball teams have moved around often since the 1950s, with several teams moving into new markets. And so instead of looking at franchises, what if we ignored the specific franchises and where they were located at that time, and instead we just looked at which cities have matched up the most often head-to-head in the World Series history, and which might give us an indication of which cities have had the biggest rivalries. Now, as with the other lists, there are a number of teams that are kind of bunched up here. So we're going to start with a tie for what we'll say is 5th or 4th place. And this one starts again with the Chicago Cubs versus the Detroit Tigers, who have met up 4 times. When I mentioned 1907, 1908, 35, and 1945 with an even split. Next is the Red Sox and St. Louis Cardinals. I discussed this one before with 4 matchups in 1946, 67, 2004, and 2013, again with an even split. So nothing too different yet. The next one in line we've seen as well. St. Louis Cardinals versus New York Yankees. 5 matchups in 1926, 28, 1942, 43, and 1964, with St. Louis leading 3 wins to 2. But this is where things change a little bit. In second place with a tie is New York versus Philadelphia. 5 times they've met up in the World Series, which includes 3 matchups in 1905, 1911, and 1913 between the Philadelphia Athletics and the New York Giants. And then the Phillies and Yankees first matchup in 1950, and the Phillies and Yankees last matchup in 2009. Now, Philadelphia actually leads this series over New York 3 wins to 2. Next up, in second place as well, is New York versus Los Angeles, again with 5. This one's kind of discussed before. We had 5 matchups in 1963, 1977, 78, 81, and 2024 between the Dodgers and Yankees. And when you actually look at it this way, not Dodgers versus Yankees history, LA actually leads against New York teams 3-2. And what is the number 1 matchup? Well, that is actually easy to guess if you think about it. It's New York versus New York. There have been 14 instances when all New York teams have faced off in the World Series. This includes all the Yankees versus New York Giants and Brooklyn Dodgers, plus the 2000 Mets. When you think about it more and how historic baseball has been in New York and Brooklyn, it makes a lot of sense that the most common matchup is actually the intercity rivalries that existed prior to the 1960s, especially before playoff expansion happened, and it was easier for teams to actually win their division and make it directly into the World Series. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about, like I said, is surprising matchups we have never actually seen. And obviously, I'm looking at the oldest teams in the league, the historic teams, because no one would really be that surprised that they haven't seen the Mariners play the Rockies, say, or the Rays play against the Marlins. That's not that surprising at all. So just looking back at those historic teams, some of the matchups we've never seen are the Red Sox versus the Braves. Both of these teams have been around since the establishment of the World Series in 1903, and even before that. And both teams used to actually reside in Boston. The Red Sox, first as the Boston Americans, represented the American League in the very first World Series in 1903, while the Boston Braves represented the National League as early as 1914. But through the years and the Braves' moves from Boston to Milwaukee to Atlanta, we have never seen these two teams good enough at the same time to meet up in the World Series. It would be pretty cool to see a Boston versus historic Boston series. And speaking of those Braves, there's actually another team that they've never met up with in the World Series, and that is the Baltimore Orioles. The Orioles spent the first half of the 20th century as the St. Louis Browns, who only made one World Series in 1944 against their crosstown rivals, the Cardinals, which is a good reason that they didn't match up against some of those earlier teams in the league. But even after making the World Series 6 more times after moving to Baltimore between the 1960s and 1980s, we still have never seen them play against the Braves, or the Cubs, or the Giants. 3 matchups that would be fun and historic to watch. The Chicago Cubs and St. Louis Cardinals have one of the biggest rivalries in baseball, which stems not only from their proximity and history in the National League, but also a historic rivalry between the cities themselves, as 19th century Chicago diverted their polluted water supply away from Lake Michigan and downstream to St. Louis instead. But you know who the Cardinals have never played in the World Series? The Chicago White Sox. You have to wonder if that series would result in a similar rivalry as the Cubs and Cardinals have, or if the Cardinals would even know that the White Sox were from Chicago. Sorry, White Sox fans. The next up for historic matchups we've never seen, Cleveland teams have played in a total of 6 World Series, but you know who they've never played against? The Cincinnati Reds. There has never been an all-Buckeye State World Series, which in my opinion is just kind of sad. The Reds have played in 9 World Series, but never against Cleveland. And the Naps, Indians, Guardians have also never matched up against the Cardinals or the Pirates either. A couple different teams, including the Reds, they haven't faced. And the last one I wanted to bring up that I thought was really interesting, the Athletics have played in 15 total World Series, including 8 while in Philadelphia in the first half of the 20th century and 6 while in Oakland in the second half of the century. The Athletics have pretty much played every historic team that exists in the National League, except 2, the Pirates and the Phillies. In all the years that the Athletics resided in Philadelphia, from 1903 to 1954, they never matched up against their crosstown rivals in the Phillies or their in-state rivals, the Pirates. Even in the years all three teams were among the best in baseball during the 1970s and 1980s, they never matched up in the World Series. And through all the trials the A's have had since 1954, many fans aren't even aware of their history in Philadelphia anymore. But I think that this would be a fun matchup to see play out one day, harkening back to those old Philadelphia Athletics against the current day heart of Philadelphia, the Phillies. So there you have it, some of the most common World Series matchups in history, and some that we've never seen but would be fun to see someday. Hope you guys enjoy the 2025 World Series. Go Blue Jays, take care of yourselves, keep talking baseball, and we'll see you around.